You destroyed everything. The words exploded across the mahogany conference table like shrapnel, each syllable designed to cut deep. My father Richard's face burned crimson with rage as he slammed the IRS audit notice down, the papers scattering like accusations across the polished surface. 7 years, Ashley. 7 goddamn years of fighting this mess because you couldn't handle simple bookkeeping. I sat frozen in my chair, watching my father's fury consume our Chicago boardroom like wildfire. My sister Victoria stood beside him, arms crossed, shaking her head with that perfect blend of disappointment and disgust she'd mastered over the years. The Christmas wreath still hung from last week's holiday party, but any warmth had long since died. If you're ready for a story of ultimate betrayal and sweet revenge, smash that like button right now, subscribe to Formidable Revenge channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because this gets absolutely insane. My name is Ashley Morrison, and at 35, I'd been living under the crushing weight of a mistake that allegedly destroyed our family's accounting empire, Morrison Financial Group. Every board meeting, every family dinner, every phone call had become a reminder of how I supposedly ruined everything we'd built together over 3 decades. "Dad, I've told you 1,000 times," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm of his accusations. "I followed every procedure exactly like you taught me. I don't understand how those entries got changed. Don't lie to me." Richard's voice cracked with raw emotion. "The IRS found deliberate alterations. Someone changed those numbers, and you were the only one with administrative access to that software." Victoria stepped forward, her expression a masterpiece of manufactured sympathy. "Ashley, we've been over this endlessly. The audit trail shows your login credentials, your workstation, your changes." She pulled out a folder thick with damning documents. "Maybe if you finally admitted what happened, we could move forward as a family." But I hadn't done anything wrong. I knew that with absolute certainty. Yet here I was, 7 years later, still trying to prove my innocence to the 2 people who should have believed me most. The audit had found discrepancies totaling nearly $300,000 in client accounts, and somehow every piece of evidence pointed directly back to me. "I've repaid every penny of those penalties," I said, feeling tears burn behind my eyes. "I've covered the legal fees, the settlements, everything. What more do you want from me?" Richard's expression softened slightly, but the disappointment remained like a scar. "I want my daughter back, the one who cared about this family enough to tell the truth." As I looked around the boardroom where I'd learned about business ethics and family loyalty, I felt that familiar ache in my chest. The walls displayed photos of our company's success, Richard receiving industry awards, Victoria graduating summa cum laude from Northwestern, and me conspicuously absent from any recent pictures. Something felt fundamentally wrong about this entire situation, but I couldn't identify what. The evidence seemed ironclad, the timeline perfect, the motive clear. Yet deep in my gut, an instinct I'd inherited from Richard himself whispered that someone was playing a game far more sophisticated than anyone realized. Growing up, I'd been the dependable daughter. While Victoria charmed everyone with her perfect grades and social connections, I was the one who stayed late to help Richard organize client files and learn the business from the ground up. I genuinely loved the work, the precision of numbers, the satisfaction of balancing books perfectly, the trust clients placed in our family firm. Victoria, 3 years younger, had always been Richard's golden child. She was stunning, brilliant, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to make everyone in a room focus solely on her. When she graduated with her MBA, Richard practically glowed with pride. "Now we can really expand the empire," he'd said. "Having both my daughters working alongside me is everything I ever dreamed of." But even back then, I'd noticed troubling patterns. Victoria would arrive late, leave early, and somehow always managed to avoid the tedious reconciliation work that kept our books accurate. She preferred schmoozing with high-profile clients and attending networking galas, leaving me to handle the detailed financial operations that actually kept the business running. "She's building relationships," Richard would say whenever I mentioned the uneven workload. That's just as valuable as the day-to-day operations. I never complained. I was proud of my skills and trusted that my contributions were valued, even if they weren't as visible as Victoria's networking triumphs. I had my own penthouse in Lincoln Park, a beautiful space where I could decompress after 12-hour days at the office. The changes began subtly in the months before the audit. Victoria started staying later, often working alone in the office after everyone else had gone home. She volunteered to handle more software updates and system maintenance tasks she'd previously avoided like the plague. I want to be more involved in the technical side, she explained when Richard praised her newfound dedication. Ashley's taught me so much about how everything connects. I remember feeling pleased that she was finally taking genuine interest in the crucial back-end operations. We even had productive conversations about accounting procedures and client management during those weeks. She asked detailed questions about our software systems and seemed genuinely curious about how everything connected. Looking back now, I realized she'd been asking about security protocols, backup procedures, and audit trails. At the time, I thought she was just being thorough. I was happy to share my expertise with my sister, never imagining she was gathering intelligence for something far more sinister. The audit notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in March. Richard opened it during our weekly executive meeting, and I watched his face drain of color as he absorbed the formal language about discrepancies requiring immediate federal investigation. "They're examining our books from the past 2 years," he said quietly. "They want everything. Every transaction, every adjustment, every piece of documentation." I felt completely confident. Our books were immaculate. I double-checked every entry, maintained perfect records, and followed every procedure to the letter. I actually welcomed the audit as an opportunity to showcase how well managed our business was. How naive I was. The federal investigators arrived 3 weeks later, and my world began its catastrophic collapse. They established their command center in our main conference room with boxes of documents and high-tech equipment, methodically dissecting every transaction with the intensity of surgeons examining a cancer patient. I cooperated fully, walking them through our procedures and explaining our filing systems with the pride of someone who had nothing to hide. Agent Rebecca Thompson seemed particularly interested in our software logs and user access records. She was thorough but professional, asking detailed questions about who had access to which systems and when. "Miss Morrison," Agent Thompson said during my formal interview, "we've discovered several entries that were modified after initial posting. Can you explain why these changes were made?" I stared at the printout she handed me, my confidence evaporating like morning mist. The numbers were completely wrong, entirely different from what I remembered entering. Client payments had been shuffled between accounts, expense categories had been altered, and there were adjustments I'd never made in my life. "I don't understand," I said, studying the documents with growing horror. "These aren't the entries I made. Someone must have changed them after I input the original data." Agent Thompson nodded, making careful notes. "According to our computer forensics team, these changes were made using your login credentials from your personal workstation. Can you explain how that might have happened?" My stomach plummeted. I always log out when I leave my desk. I never share my password with anyone. The timestamp shows these changes were made at 11:47 p.m. on February 14th. Were you in the office that night? February 14th, Valentine's Day. I'd been home that evening having dinner with my college roommate Patricia at Gibson's Steakhouse downtown. I had the receipt in my purse, the credit card statement, even photos we'd taken at the bar. "No, I was out that evening. I can prove it." I showed her the evidence, feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. Someone else must have used my login somehow. But Agent Thompson's expression remained professionally neutral. "We'll need to investigate further. In the meantime, we'll need you to step away from any financial responsibilities until this is resolved." The investigation dragged on for agonizing months. Every week brought new questions, new accusations, new evidence that seemed to point directly at me with surgical precision. The computer logs showed my credentials, my workstation, my access codes. The financial discrepancies totaled $297,000 across multiple client accounts. Richard grew more distant with each devastating revelation. "How is this possible, Ashley?" he asked during one particularly brutal family dinner. "If you didn't make these changes, then who did?" Victoria was supportive during those early days, often staying after our family meetings to offer comfort. "I know you didn't do this intentionally," she'd say with perfect sincerity. "Maybe you were overwhelmed and made some errors. Dad will understand eventually." But I knew I hadn't made any errors. I'd been meticulous, careful, and professional. Someone had deliberately sabotaged our books, and that someone had done it using my access credentials. The question that haunted me as the investigation continued was devastatingly simple: who else could have obtained my login information? I was about to discover that the answer was closer to home than I ever imagined, and far more sinister than I could have conceived. The final audit report arrived on a gray October morning, shattering what remained of my relationship with my family like glass against concrete. The investigators had concluded that the alterations were deliberate, sophisticated, and designed to conceal missing funds. The penalties alone would cost the business nearly $400,000, not including legal fees and the irreparable damage to our reputation. Richard called an emergency family meeting that evening. I walked into his home office feeling like I was approaching my own execution. The room smelled of aged leather and crushing disappointment, the same space where he taught me about business ethics and family loyalty years before. "The final report confirms everything," Richard said without looking up from the paperwork. "Deliberate manipulation of client accounts. Funds moved between accounts to hide shortfalls. The pattern shows extensive planning and clear intent." Victoria sat in the chair across from his desk, her face a masterpiece of carefully controlled emotion. "What does this mean for the business?" she asked quietly. "We'll survive, but barely. The penalties will eliminate most of our reserves. Some clients are already discussing terminating their contracts." Richard finally looked at me, and I saw something die in his eyes. "Ashley, I need to know. Did you steal money from client accounts?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. "Dad, I would never steal from our clients. You know me better than that." "I thought I did." His voice was barely a whisper. "But the evidence doesn't lie. The computer logs, the timing, the sophistication of the alterations. Everything points to someone with your level of access and knowledge." Victoria reached across the desk and touched Richard's hand gently. "Dad, maybe we should consider that this was a cry for help. Ashley's been under tremendous stress lately." I stared at my sister in complete disbelief. "A cry for help? Victoria, I didn't do this." "The evidence says otherwise," Richard said firmly. "And until you're willing to take responsibility for what you've done, I can't have you involved in the business." Something in his tone made my blood freeze. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying you're out. No ownership, no inheritance, no involvement in Morrison Financial Group. Actions have consequences, Ashley. When you're ready to tell the truth, we can discuss rebuilding trust." Over the following months, the financial pressure became absolutely crushing. The business couldn't afford to pay the penalties, so I voluntarily assumed the entire debt. I mortgaged my penthouse, took out massive personal loans, and started working freelance accounting jobs to generate enough income to cover the payments. Every month, I sent checks to cover legal fees, audit penalties, and business loans. Every month, I felt the weight of guilt and confusion pressing down on me like a tombstone. My family gatherings became public exercises in ritualized shame, with Richard and Victoria treating me like a criminal who simply hadn't confessed yet. "We appreciate what you're doing to make this right," Victoria would say in front of other family members, her voice dripping with false compassion. "It takes real courage to face the consequences of your mistakes. But I hadn't made any mistakes. I knew that with absolute certainty, even as everyone around me insisted otherwise. The problem was proving it while drowning in debt and professional exile. I started keeping obsessive records of every payment I made, every sacrifice I endured, every humiliation I suffered. If I was going to bear this burden, I wanted complete documentation of exactly what it cost me. The file grew thick with receipts, bank statements, and copies of checks totaling over $300,000 in penalties and fees. The worst part wasn't the money, it was the suffocating isolation. Friends started treating me differently when word spread about the audit. Professional contacts became distant and suspicious. Even casual acquaintances seemed to look at me like financial fraud was contagious. I found myself working 16-hour days, partly to pay the crushing bills and partly to avoid the judgmental stares and whispered conversations. My world had shrunk to my increasingly empty apartment, my freelance clients, and the monthly ritual of writing checks to cover my supposed crimes. But late at night, when the bills were paid and the apartment was silent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was wrong with the entire situation. The evidence was too perfect, the timing too convenient, the outcome too beneficial for certain parties. 2 years into my exile from the family business, I began noticing patterns that made absolutely no sense. While I struggled desperately to cover audit penalties and legal fees, Victoria seemed to be thriving beyond all reasonable explanation. She'd moved into a luxury high-rise in downtown Chicago, started driving a brand-new BMW X7, and had taken several expensive European vacations that she documented extensively on social media. Business consulting is really exploding, she explained when I asked about her obvious prosperity during one awkward family dinner. I've been helping other accounting firms improve their security and compliance procedures. The irony was suffocating. My sister was building a lucrative career on the back of our family's audit disaster, positioning herself as an expert on the very problems that had supposedly been my fault. She spoke at industry conferences about preventing internal fraud and identifying warning signs of employee misconduct. Richard beamed with pride when she showed us articles featuring her expertise. At least something positive came out of this nightmare, he said, carefully avoiding eye contact with me. Victoria's really made a name for herself. I forced myself to smile and offer congratulations, but something twisted violently in my stomach. While I worked 70-hour weeks to pay for penalties I didn't incur, my sister was profiting handsomely from our family's reputation crisis. The breaking point came during Thanksgiving dinner that year. We were gathered around Richard's massive dining room table, the same table where we'd celebrated business successes and family milestones for decades. The conversation turned to Victoria's latest consulting contract, a prestigious engagement with a major accounting firm in San Francisco. They specifically requested me because of my experience with audit remediation, Victoria said, cutting into her turkey with precise movements. They want someone who understands how these fraud schemes develop and how to prevent them. Fraud schemes, I repeated slowly. Is that what we're calling what happened to our business? Victoria looked up, her knife pausing mid-cut. Well, yes. The audit found evidence of deliberate manipulation. That's fraud by definition. And you think I deliberately manipulated our books to steal from clients? The table went completely silent. Richard set down his fork and looked between us with the expression of a man exhausted from refereeing the same fight for years. Ashley, we've been through this, he said quietly. The evidence was overwhelming. Can we please just have a peaceful dinner? But I couldn't let it go. Not anymore. Victoria, when you consult with these firms about preventing fraud, do you tell them that the perpetrator in our case was never actually prosecuted? That the supposed criminal was never even formally accused of a crime? Victoria's composure cracked slightly. The lack of criminal charges doesn't mean no crime occurred. Sometimes prosecutors choose not to pursue cases due to insufficient evidence to meet the criminal standard of proof, she said quickly. That doesn't mean the behavior was acceptable or that there weren't serious consequences. I stared at my sister across the table, studying her face in the candlelight. Something in her tone, in the way she'd answered so quickly and specifically, triggered a memory that made my pulse quicken. During the audit, she demonstrated unusual knowledge of legal standards and prosecution guidelines for financial crimes. At the time, I'd assumed she was just researching to better understand our situation. Now, I wondered if there was another explanation entirely. "You seem to know quite a lot about criminal prosecution standards," I said carefully. "Have you been researching this topic extensively?" Victoria's hand tightened on her knife. "Of course I have. Our family business was nearly destroyed. I wanted to understand exactly what happened and how to prevent it from happening again." The conversation moved on, but I couldn't stop thinking about her reaction. Something in her eyes had shifted when I'd pressed her about the legal details. Something that looked suspiciously like fear. I made a decision that night that would change everything. I was going to find out what really happened to our family business, no matter what it cost me. Because deep in my gut, I knew someone had been lying to me for years. And I had a growing suspicion about exactly who that someone was. I started my investigation the next morning, driven by an intuition I could no longer ignore. If someone had used my login credentials to alter our books, they would have needed detailed knowledge of our systems, physical access to the office, and familiarity with accounting procedures sophisticated enough to fool a federal audit. The list of people with that combination of knowledge and opportunity was devastatingly short. I contacted our former IT consultant, Marcus Chen, who had helped us design our computer systems. Over coffee at a downtown cafe, I asked him about security protocols and user access logs. "The thing about your old system," Marcus said, stirring sugar into his espresso, "is that it kept much more detailed logs than most people realized. Every keystroke, every mouse click, every file access was recorded with timestamps and location data." My heart began racing. Location data? IP addresses, machine identifiers, even physical location if the computer had GPS capabilities. The audit team probably only looked at the basic login information, but there would have been much more detailed data available if someone knew where to look. Would that data still exist? Depends on backup procedures. Most firms keep archived logs for at least 7 years for compliance purposes. You'd need administrative access to retrieve them, though. I spent the next week researching data recovery and forensic analysis procedures. What I learned was both encouraging and frustrating. The detailed logs Marcus described would indeed show exactly who had made what changes when, but accessing them would require technical expertise I didn't possess. Then I remembered something crucial. Before the audit, Victoria had volunteered to handle our system backups and archive procedures. She'd insisted on taking over that responsibility, claiming she wanted to learn more about the technical side of the business. At the time, I'd been pleased by her initiative. Now, I wondered if there had been a more sinister motive. I drove to the office building where Morrison Financial Group had operated. The business had downsized significantly after the audit, but Richard still maintained a small office on the 3rd floor for the remaining clients. I used my old access card, praying he hadn't deactivated it. The office was eerily quiet and dimly lit. Most of our equipment was gone, but I knew Richard kept critical records and backup drives in the fireproof safe behind his desk. If the detailed system logs still existed, they would be there. I found boxes of backup drives dating back 8 years, each labeled with dates and system identifiers. My hands trembled as I located the drives covering the period when the fraudulent entries had been made. Using a laptop I'd brought, I began searching through archived files. The technical data was overwhelming, thousands of entries showing every interaction with our accounting system. But slowly, patterns began to emerge that made my blood turn to ice. The fraudulent entries had indeed been made using my login credentials. But according to the detailed logs Marcus had described, they'd been made from Victoria's computer, using her IP address, from her physical location in the office. I stared at the screen, hardly believing what I was seeing. The timestamp showed that someone had used my login from Victoria's workstation during evening hours when I could prove I was elsewhere. More importantly, the logs showed that Victoria's credentials had been used to access my password file several days before each fraudulent entry. She had stolen my login information, used it to make the alterations, and then covered her tracks by deleting the obvious evidence while preserving plausible deniability. But there was more. Hidden in a folder marked Personal Backup, I found something that stopped my heart completely. It was an email draft, never sent, dated 3 days before the audit notice arrived. The subject line read, "Contingency Plan, A Investigation." I opened the file with trembling fingers and read the most devastating betrayal of my entire life. The email was addressed to no one, clearly a draft that Victoria had written but never intended to send. It was a detailed blueprint for handling the upcoming audit and ensuring that I would take complete blame for her alterations to our books. The changes I made to client accounts should be discovered within the next few weeks, the email began. I've been careful to use Ashley's login credentials for every alteration, and I've deleted the obvious traces from the system logs. When the investigation begins, all evidence will point directly to her. I read those words 3 times before their full meaning penetrated my consciousness. My sister had deliberately sabotaged our family business and systematically framed me for her crimes. But the betrayal went even deeper. Ashley's personality works perfectly in my favor, the email continued. She's always been the responsible one, the one who accepts blame even when it's not deserved. She'll take guilt for these changes because she can't imagine that her own sister would betray her so completely. The clinical detachment in her tone was almost worse than the betrayal itself. She had studied my character, identified my psychological weaknesses, and exploited them with surgical precision. The key will be maintaining sympathy for her while supporting Dad's disappointment. I need to appear loyal to family while letting her dig herself deeper into guilt and isolation. The consulting opportunities from this audit scandal should be worth at least $750,000 over the next 3 years. My hands shook as I printed multiple copies of the email. This wasn't just fraud, it was calculated psychological warfare. Deliberate destruction of family bonds for financial gain. Victoria had stolen money, destroyed our business, and obliterated my reputation because she saw an opportunity to profit from our family's crisis. The email ended with a detailed list of potential consulting clients and speaking opportunities that would be available to someone with insider experience in accounting fraud cases. She had planned to build her entire career on the smoldering ruins of our family business and my destroyed reputation. I sat in that empty office, surrounded by the ghosts of our family's success, and felt a cold fury settle in my chest like winter fog. For 7 years, I had carried guilt that belonged to someone else. I had paid for crimes I didn't commit, endured shame I didn't deserve, and watched my sister profit obscenely from my suffering. But something had shifted in me during those 7 years of exile and humiliation. I'd learned patience, strategic thinking, and the value of meticulous documentation. Victoria had made one critical mistake in her perfect plan. She'd underestimated exactly how thorough and persistent her victim could be when pushed beyond her breaking point. The next morning, I made 3 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to Marcus Chun, asking him to perform a complete forensic analysis of the backup drives I'd discovered. The second was to Agent Rebecca Thompson, informing her that new evidence had emerged in the Morrison Financial Group case. The third call was the most important. I contacted Lawrence Hartwell, Chicago's most ruthless white-collar criminal defense attorney, and retained him to represent me in what was about to become the most spectacular fraud case in the city's recent history. But I wasn't finished. Victoria had spent 7 years building her consulting empire on my destroyed reputation. She'd positioned herself as an expert in preventing the exact crimes she'd committed. She'd profited from speaking engagements, consulting contracts, and media appearances, all while watching me struggle to pay for her sins. I was going to make sure that empire crumbled in the most public and humiliating way possible. I started by creating a detailed timeline of Victoria's financial growth since the audit, cross-referencing her consulting income with speaking fees and media appearances. The pattern was damning. Every dollar she'd earned was directly connected to her supposed expertise in the Morrison Financial Group fraud case. Then I began documenting her lies. Every interview she'd given, every conference presentation, every consulting proposal contained fabrications about her role in discovering the fraud and implementing security measures to prevent similar crimes. She'd built her entire professional identity on a foundation of lies, and I was going to expose every single one of them. But the investigation revealed something even more sinister. Victoria hadn't stopped with framing me for her original crimes. Over the past 3 years, she'd been systematically overcharging her consulting clients, using the same sophisticated techniques she'd employed at Morrison Financial Group. She was still committing fraud, hiding behind the reputation she'd stolen from me. That's when I realized this wasn't just about clearing my name or getting revenge. Victoria was an active threat to every client who trusted her, every business that paid for her expertise, every firm that invited her to speak about fraud prevention. She was a predator wearing the mask of an expert, and she needed to be stopped before she destroyed more lives.